A few weeks ago, I brought you a video with a Lamborghini Espada, and I called it one of the strangest Lamborghinis ever made. And you agreed it was quite weird, but it isn't the weirdest, because that would be this, the Lamborghini Jarama. Allow me to set the stage. It's 1970 and Lamborghini is making the Miura sports car, already world famous for its gorgeous design. Then they come out with the Espada, a V12 powered four-seater. Now, say you're Lamborghini, what do you do next? Maybe make an entry-level model, maybe a convertible? No, they decided to come out with another V12 four-seater. That would be this, the Jarama. And it uses the exact same V12 as the Espada, and it basically occupies the same position in the Lamborghini lineup. Except for two things. Number one, the Jarama is far, far stranger looking than the Espada, and that's no easy feat because the Espada is rather strange looking. Number two, the Jarama is far rarer. Lamborghini sold this car from 1970 to 1976, and they made just 328 examples over that time. Production was split into two models, the GT and the GTS. The GTs, like this one, were the earlier cars, and they only made 176 of these. Now, those low numbers are probably because nobody wanted to buy it, but I have to admit, I've always kind of loved this car. You know how some people are into fast sports cars and cool exotics, and other people are into weird cars like the Isuzu V-Cross and the GMC Envoy XUV? Well, the Jarama is the V-Cross of the Lamborghini world. It's often forgotten, it's rarely mentioned, and it's incredibly rare, and I can't wait to show you around it. I should mention, I borrowed this car from Tomini Classics here in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. It's an exotic car dealership with some amazing inventory and an excellent staff. They have some incredible cars. Just look at this place. Today, I'm going to show you all of the quirks of the Jarama and show you why this is truly the weirdest Lamborghini ever made. Then I'm going to take it out on the road and drive it, and then of course I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Jarama, click the link below to go to autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of the strangest Lamborghini models currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Now, I know so far the Jarama may seem similar to the Espada I reviewed just last week, but this car is its own breed of insane and weird, way more than that one, so bear with me and I swear it'll be worth it. I'm going to start back here with maybe the most interesting quirk of the Jarama, and that is the fact that it isn't a hatchback. It looks like one. It has this steeply raked hatchback window. It came at a time when hatchbacks were just starting to get popular, and yet it has a trunk. And when you open the trunk, there's a little prop so that you can leave the trunk open. The trunk is actually surprisingly big. The thing I like best about the prop is that it's only on one side, and so when the trunk is open, it's kind of tilted to one side. But this was the Italians in the 70s, and they didn't really care. Now, if you're trying to get into the trunk, you have two options. You can walk up to it and open it with one of the mini keys that come with this car. More on that in a second. Or you can pop it down here, just pull this little handle and the trunk opens. The most interesting thing about this handle, take a look down there, the handle has a lock on it. In other words, there are two ways to lock the trunk. Close it on the outside and it's locked and you need a key to open it. Or you can lock it from the inside by locking the handle itself, and then would-be thieves can't even try to get into the trunk by pulling the handle since the handle is locked. I've never seen that in a car before. Next up, the usual, this car has rear seats, and apparently I have become the person who has to climb into the rear seats of every uncomfortable car ever made with back seats, and so here goes. Now, it's worth noting that getting into the rear seats, just starting the process is rather difficult. There's no latch, you just pull the seat forward and it moves forward. Instead, you have to twist a little handle over and over and over to get it to go forward, and then it just stops. It stops at a 90-degree angle. You can't get it any further forward than this, so this is all you get. And once it's in this position, well, good luck. Here goes. Oh. Oh man, I'm never getting out of here. I'm gonna die in the back of a Lamborghini Jarama. You know, now that I'm back here, it's actually not so bad. Of course, the front seat is all the way forward, but it's actually relatively roomy, and I have a ton of headroom. I probably have 4 inches, maybe have 2 inches between my head and the ceiling. But just getting back here is the problem. If the seat went further forward, it wouldn't be such a big deal, but because it doesn't, this is pretty much a 2-seat car with back seats that are just there to put stuff in. Now, even though it's impossible to get into these back seats, it's worth noting that Lamborghini fitted them with an ashtray, because after all, it was the 70s, everybody smoked, including the non-existent people who rode in the back of this car. Moving on to the door panel, there are a couple of interesting things here. Number one is the interior door handle. It's not just a little handle you pull, instead it's this little leather lined thing that you pull up and that gets you out of the car. Maybe more interesting is the window roller downer. Now these are power windows and they're mounted on the center console. We'll get to those in a second, but there's a little plug down here for something that looks like it would have been the crank. As it turns out, that was a redundant window control. A tool came with the car you could stick in there and use to roll down the windows if the power windows failed. And so speaking of that, let's talk about these power window switches. Like I said, they're mounted in the center console. They're giant. They're like 2 inches by 1 inch. But the most interesting thing is they don't have a diagram of the window on them. Instead, there's just an arrow pointing to which window they control. You're supposed to figure out the rest. Now, the fact that the power window switches are unlabeled is only the beginning of the unbelievable level of bizarre buttons and switches inside this car, starting with the horn. The horn is not in the middle. Instead, there's just the Lamborghini logo there, the bull. The horn is over on the side on the turn signal stalk. You push it in towards the steering wheel, and that activates the horn. The horn in this car is, well, it's rather interesting. Take a listen. This car has one of the meanest exhaust notes in existence. You'll hear it in just a second. It's crazy, and yet it has that crappy little horn. It sounds like a music note. It's ridiculous, but that was true of a lot of Italian cars of the day. Also true of a lot of Italian cars of this time period, there were ridiculous switches, and like I said, this car is no exception. One of the craziest things about it is that most of the switches for this car are not in the center like virtually every other car. Instead, they've fitted them between the steering wheel and the gauges. It makes absolutely no sense, but that's where virtually all of the switches to control most of the car functions are located, and boy are they strange. Now your basic setup is this. You got 6 switches separated into 2 banks with 2 little dials on either side of all 6. So there's 6 switches and 4 dials. And on the far left you have the windshield wiper control. In the middle you have the control for the headlights. And on the right there is a button to turn on and off the lights in the gauge cluster. In a lot of cars there's a dimmer, but in this car it's just a button. Push it, they're off. Push it, and they're back on. Now on the left and right of those 3 switches there are 2 dials. I have had this car on, I have played with those dials. I can't figure out what they do. Have absolutely no purpose. I really cannot figure it out. In fact, they are among 5 dials that I can't figure out what function they have. Moving over to the right, there's another 2. One of them is a little button that looks like sort of a heating coil inside of a circle. I feel like this is probably the rear defroster, except this car doesn't have lines across the rear window, so it can be defrosted. More importantly, when you put on that switch, a little light comes on in the gauge cluster with the most cryptic diagram I have ever seen of anything in any car. It looks like a saw with a toothbrush coming out of it, and then there's some sort of can that's spraying. I have no idea what it does, and that is far from the only cryptic dial in the interior of this car. On the right of that button with the heating coil, there's another button, and it looks like some sort of soup dish. Look at that, you can see the bowl, and there's a lid on it, and then there's little steam rising from it. I have no idea what that does. When the car is on, I push it and nothing happens. Perhaps it's just telling the car that you want some soup. Now, the other buttons and switches on that side are pretty self-explanatory. On the left, there's the air conditioning that controls the amount, and on the right, it controls the temperature, and then there is a fan button to turn on and off the fan. And to the right of all of those buttons and switches, you will find maybe the most bizarre dial in the entire car. It's a little dial that's just sort of sitting out there with no explanation, and on it, it has a music clef and a music note. Now, the radio is elsewhere. It's not even in the center console. I'll get to that in a minute because it's also bizarre, but this thing just sort of sits there and it does something with music. I played around with it, and it turns out that it changes where in the car that you're hearing the music. If you twist it all the way to the right, it's on the passenger side, and if you twist it all the way to the left, the sound changes and it's coming out the speakers on the driver's side. I've never seen any car that has a dial for this feature, and yet this one does. Of course, there's also another ashtray in the center, which is no surprise, and below that, there's something that kind of sums up the production quality of these old Lamborghinis, the climate control switches that sort of direct where the air goes. You can tell that they are not straight. In fact, they're not even really close to straight, but it doesn't appear that they were moved from their original position. Look at that, they sort of fit right into the leather, which suggests that at the factory they were placed on there in this sort of odd configuration where one's a little higher than the other and one's a little crooked, and Lamborghini stuck in there and said, yeah, that'll do. And the that'll do philosophy moves on to the radio, which is in the strangest place of any car's radio I've ever seen. It's in the center, and it's in the center console in between the two seats. And that in itself isn't all that weird. That's where the radio is in my Land Rover Defender. But the strange thing about this is in the Defender it's facing up towards the seats. In this car it's facing forward towards the windshield. When you're sitting in the driver's seat facing forward, you cannot see a single control on this radio. You basically have to look up and then you can see the radio. It actually would have made more sense if they had mounted the radio upside down so you could read it like this, but they didn't. It's mounted right side up, so it's best read from over here, pretty much. It is one of the most bizarre radio placements I've ever seen. You basically have to control the radio by feel. And I'm not done with the weird buttons and the weird placement of everything just yet. Now, right above that strangely placed radio, in between the window switches, there's a little button just like the window switches with 2 arrows on it. You push this button and nothing happens. And I have no idea what it even could be. Only after pushing it with the car on and the stereo on did I discover that it changes where the sound goes. You push the up arrow and it moves the stereo sound to the front. You push the down arrow and it moves it to the back. Another interesting placement is the button for the windshield washers. Yes, this car has windshield washers, and there they are right there in front of the windshield, in between the windshield wipers. But the button placement is weird. Like I showed you, the wipers are up on the left of the gauge cluster, but the washers are in the middle next to the clock. And despite all the cryptic labels and weird buttons in this car, the windshield washers are labeled press for washers. Same for the hazard lights. They're to the left of the dashboard, and even though the symbol for hazard lights is universally recognized by everyone, and this car has a lot of bizarre symbols, Lamborghini skipped it. Instead it says emergency flashers. Upside down. Now there are a couple of other interesting quirks in this car beyond the weird buttons and switches, one of which is the shifter. Now from the driver's position it just looks like a regular normal shifter, but the cool thing about this shifter is there are little indentations on the top of this shifter for where you're supposed to put your fingers when you're actually shifting gears, which I find to be kind of cool. Also interesting in this car is the glove box. Now this was supposed to be a practical Lamborghini, and so it has a practical glove box. Open it right up and you'll find that the glove box is actually twice as deep as the little glove box door would suggest. And then you'll find a couple of weird quirks in the driver's footwell, one of which is the parking brake. I always find it interesting when the parking brake shares space with the driver's footwell. It never makes for a comfortable experience, but it's not so bad in this car. And then on the left in the driver's footwell, there's a light down there. Now there's often lights inside driver's footwells on a lot of cars so that when you open the door you can see where your feet go, but in this car you can turn on and off that light manually. So you can turn it on even if the door is closed and you just kind of want to stare at your shoes. It's also nice to have that light down there for all those times that you have to go and work on your Lamborghini Jarama and the wiring that is under the steering column. But anyway, back to those switches next to the gauge cluster. Now as I mentioned, the second one on the left controls the headlights, and when you press the headlight switch, this happens. Yep, that's right. When you turn on the headlights, it has basically pop-up headlights, but they don't pop up. Instead, the covers for the headlights pop away. So when you turn them on, they go down and they come back up when you turn them off to reveal the car in its headlightless form. There are very few cars that are like this, but well, this one is. Now, since I'm outside the car, a couple of other interesting things on the outside. Number one is the fuel door placement. Now, if you look, you can see it's right there on the C-pillar. That's a little bit of an odd place to put it. It's a little bit higher up than in most cars, but that's not the strange thing about the fuel door. The strange thing is that there's one on that side and then there's a fake one on this side that has no apparent function. I have no idea why they bothered to put this little cutout on the other side of the car, but I guess it's there for symmetry. Now you'll notice that the fuel door also locks, and that's one of the most interesting things about the Jarama, specifically the fact that there are so many locks on this car. I already showed you the one for the trunk handle on the inside and on the outside, the glove box, and of course the engine starting. There are 4 different keys that you get when you buy a Jarama. One for each function and each lock in the Jarama, so if you lose one, you lose access to whatever that particular key controlled. So it's not just keeping track of your ignition key, you also have to keep track of 3 others if you want to access your trunk, your fuel door, and your glove box. Also notable on the outside of this car, the Jarama shared its wheel design with the famed Lamborghini Miura, although that's about the only thing it shared. It's hard to believe these 2 cars came from the same company at the same time period because the Jarama is so radically uglier with that weird short wheelbase and the faux hatchback look and that long rear overhang. It must be the strangest looking Lamborghini of all time. And if you asked a bystander to guess which brand made this car, their very last guess ever would be Lamborghini. Unless, of course, they hear it, because that's the best quirk, or should I say feature, of this car. It sounds like it's qualifying for Le Mans every time you rev it up. Okay, so those are all the weird quirks and features of the odd Lamborghini Jarama. And now it's time for yet another quirk, which is simply getting behind the wheel and driving it. With only 328 of these ever made in the entire world, I strongly suspect I will be the only person driving a Jarama today, or this month. All right, time to drive the Jarama. The first thing you notice, it is incredibly tight in here, designed for little Italian men. Touching that wood steering wheel is so cool. It's such an old school thing. First impression, the clutch isn't as bad as I was expecting. It's actually pretty decent. Oh, that sound is wonderful. And that's 4,000 RPM. The non-power steering makes it pretty heavy, obviously. Alright, I'm flooring it now. Woo! It's not that fast. Woo! But it sounds so good. So good. This is one of the better sounding cars I've heard. The mirror is just ridiculously tiny. It's mounted on the door. It's only circular. It's only a little larger than a poker chip. This car feels tremendously solid, surprisingly so. We're on the highway here. It's a very smooth road, of course, but it's actually driving really well. There can't be many Jaramas in nice shape like this that actually feel acceptable to drive all the time. Although I don't know if I really want to drive it all the time. It's hard to overstate how tight it is in this cabin. My knees and the steering wheel are having a battle right now, and my knees are losing. And the sound is so good. It basically counteracts everything else that could be a problem, including how tight it is, although it is really tight. Oh, here we go. We got a tunnel. Oh, my God. Wow. God, this thing sounds amazing. Even not in the tunnel, I mean, it's incredible how good it sounds. And you don't have to get really far into the rev range in order to hear that noise. You start forgetting about how weird this car looks when you hear that unbelievable sound. The steering is not, the steering is incredibly heavy, and it's a pretty big car. So moving it around, it doesn't feel nimble or agile by any means. The funny thing is, I'm not really going all that fast. I'm only going 90 kilometers, which is like 55 miles an hour. But it just feels so fast. The sound, it's incredible. It is comfortable, though. It's surprisingly comfortable in here. The seats are nice and comfortable. I have enough room in every other respect aside from my knees. But I've probably got 4 inches of headroom left before my head hits the ceiling. It has a lot of room, and it's a nice, comfortable seat. It's not some really tight sports seat. But what it does feel is it doesn't feel like it's jiggling or it's weirdly out of balance like some Italian cars from the old days. Some of those you just don't want to spend any time in. This thing you could actually take on a long trip if you were about 4 inches shorter than me. So that's the Lamborghini Jarama experience. This is the most bizarre looking Lamborghini, and when it went on sale in 1970, it was Lamborghini's second 4-seater car powered by the same V12, so it had no real purpose. Today, these are going for, I don't know, maybe $200,000, but that's if you can find one, and finding one is no easy feat. I'm really glad I found this one, and I got the chance to get acquainted with a Lamborghini that's a lot different than the ones we know. And now it's time for the Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, you thought the Espada looked weird. That was nothing. I'm giving this only a 3 out of 10. Acceleration, it does 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds, which gives it a 2 out of 10. And please remember, acceleration is based on an objective scale based on 0 to 60 time. You can find a link to the scale in the description below. Handling is fine, not great, but decent enough, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Cool factor is debatable. Some people wouldn't consider this car cool and have no idea what it is, but with that sound and the insane rarity of these these, it easily earns an 8 out of 10. Finally, there's importance. Lamborghini has made many important vehicles over the years, but this isn't one of them. In fact, I suspect most people have never even heard of this before, and it gets only a 6 out of 10, bringing the total weekend score to 24 out of 50, one less than the Espada, which makes sense because it's a little worse. Next up are the daily categories, starting with features. Since we live in today, I measure the cars by today's standards, and the Jarama is obviously low on features, so it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is generally good, except the interior room is so lacking, I simply can't give it better than a 4 out of 10. Quality is certainly below average. Between the undoubtedly high cost to maintain this car and, well, did you see that interior stuff? Still, it has some nice materials and it gets a 4 out of 10. Next up is practicality, where it's decidedly worse than the Espada. The backseat is much less livable and the cargo area is smaller since it has a trunk and not a hatchback, and it gets only a 3 out of 10. Finally, there's value. These are ultra rare and they're still underperforming the classic Lamborghini market in general, which should make for a high score, but it's hard to imagine paying 200 grand for this thing. It's right in the middle with a 6 out of 10, bringing the total daily score to a mere 19 out of 50. Add it all up and the total Doug score is 43 out of 100, which is among the worst. Then again, it's old, uncomfortable, difficult to maintain, and slow by modern standards. But it's also rare and weird, and I love it. This is one of the early ones, a Jarama GT, and they made only 100 and some number that I've forgotten. Oh! Oh!